This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Congressman Ro Khanna, Democrat of California, talks about his book, Dignity in a Digital Age. He discusses the digital divide in America and offers his suggestions on how to close the gap.
You know, at the heart of the book is this sense, well, you had the deindustrialization of so many places in this country. You've had the lack of economic opportunity in places, and these are proud places. I mean, Cleveland was the Silicon Valley of a time in the 20th century, as was Detroit. They don't want just all these Silicon Valley billionaires making money and having some handout. They want to participate with pride in the economic production of the 21st century.
He's interviewed by founder and editor-in-chief of the Markup, Julia Angwin.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Congressman, thank you for joining us to talk about your book, Dignity in a Digital Age.
Thank you for having me.
I have to say, I admire it's a pleasure. I have to say, I admire the work you put into your book. It would have been, I think, very easy to just put together the usual political vagueness about how we should all live in peace and harmony. But you actually interrogate your own positions in a really interesting way. You fact-check your results of the job training programs that you tout. You take positions on things like the right to repair that likely don't make you friends in your district with the tech giant Apple. It's a brave book in that respect. And it made me think about what was your general philosophy writing this? You know, we share a bit of history. We both went to University of Chicago. I grew up in Palo Alto, which is not your district, but a few miles away. And those are both very libertarian free market places, right? And you do have a strain of that in your book. You do really believe in free enterprise and innovation, but you do advocate for a lot of robust government intervention in mergers, privacy protection, jobs creation. And I would love to hear from you your overarching governing philosophy and how you square it with the sometimes libertarian views of your district.
Well, I appreciate the time you took to read the actual book, which is not always the case. I would say two things. One, on the book itself, my theme was how do we have more democratic accountability for technology? That technology, both in terms of the impact on the economy and in terms of the impact on the public sphere, has been disconnected, in my view, from democratic accountability. It's led to a concentration of economic opportunity on the economic side, and it's led to a insular decision-making on the public sphere side. And the thesis of the book is how do we democratize that? In terms of a more governing philosophy, I mean, I often remind tech leaders that, they started out on third base. I mean, it was DARPA and Vint Cerf who really came up with the internet. A lot of GPS was developed at DARPA. You had NSF then fund a lot of the connectivity. And so I deeply admire the entrepreneurship and innovation of a lot of the Silicon Valley leaders. But I don't think that they should forget a lot of the government spending and government investment that went into it. And government certainly has a role to make sure people have equal access now to participating in that market. As I often say, you may have a competition on a football field, but everyone has to have helmets and a uniform. And government is basically trying to do that, and not everyone in our country currently has basically the fundamental equipment to succeed in a market economy.
Got it. Well, that is, I'm interested to know what you hear from the tech leaders when you remind them of that, because my experience as a journalist is they don't always like to be reminded of the government origins of some of our most powerful technology.
Well, some of the ones who are more thoughtful get it. I mean, I think what offends, in my view, many people about technology is the bravado, the utopianism, the arrogance, right? So I don't think anyone would fault a tech platform if they said, look, we've created these platforms, social media, et cetera, and we didn't really anticipate all of the negative harms. But that wasn't their approach. They said, we've created these platforms and we're going to have peace and mutual understanding. And part of me thought, well, if it were that easy, why would you need political philosophy? Why would you need political theory? If you could just put up a platform and everyone talks and somehow that's going to have equality and dialogue, then you wouldn't need 200 years or thousands of years of political thinking. And so I think the same thing is true about the point of the government origins. I don't think anyone thinks that Elon Musk isn't a great, talented entrepreneur, or Steve Jobs, or others. But if they just acknowledged their debt, for example, Elon Musk got loans from the Treasury Department for Tesla, and he prepaid those fast because he didn't want the government to make a lot of money, and that was all legal. But you should just acknowledge that instead of just saying, "Well, everything I did was because of me."
Right. Well, it's a good lesson in humility, which is, rare in Silicon Valley. I want to talk about concentration of economic power, which you mentioned as one of the top themes in your book. It's a hot topic in Washington right now, antitrust. It feels like one of the few issues with bipartisan support. In your book, you lay out 4 antitrust principles that you say could prevent big tech from boxing out competitors while not destroying services that consumers want. Rules to prevent abuse of dominance, rules to foster a duty to deal fairly, the right to repair, a limit to mergers. But you say you want to steer clear of overbroad measures like breaking up big tech. You opposed the House antitrust bill that passed out of committee last year and said it was poorly drafted. And now the Senate has just passed committee legislation containing similar principles. So I'm curious where you stand on the current antitrust legislation and what you want to see more of from it.
So I support largely Senator Klobuchar's approach, and I think the Senate version is better than the House version. There's still certain tweaks I would make, but let me give you the overall philosophy. I mean, I do think certain cases breakups are justified. On Facebook, for example, where they've acquired Instagram and WhatsApp, I do think that you should have a unraveling of that company. And I think we want to have a ban on mergers that are acquiring competitors. But I don't think you want to ban or be overly restrictive on all mergers, as there are a lot of startups that have that as an acquisition strategy as their exit. And so I think Senator Klobuchar says over $5 billion, there should change the default setting. We can debate whether it's $5 billion or $1 billion. That seems to me very reasonable. You want to make sure, in my view, that companies shouldn't be able to discriminate against sellers. So let's take Amazon or Apple. If I or you or someone else wants to sell on there, I think they should have a duty to allow that. They shouldn't be able to discriminate against selling because they are such important platforms. But what I do say is there has to be a balance. If they don't want, for example, Parler or some app that violates their fundamental values or violates their security, they should have that ability as long as they can show that, and I argue basically for a balancing test. Where I thought some of the House bills weren't drafted well enough is there wasn't this balancing test. There wasn't a sense of, okay, well, if you are discriminating against a seller, but you can show why it's a good reason, like in my view on Parler, then you should be able to do so. If you could add that balancing test, I would be fine with the legislation.
You had mentioned last year that you were maybe going to be working to craft an alternative antitrust bill in the House. Is that still something you're working on?
Well, I want to work on where people are at because I don't want to do some alternative that has no momentum and then doesn't get through committee. So what I have said to the drafters of those bills is I'm happy to work with them. I understand where they're coming from to help bring them to a point where they can pass. And I do think the Senate efforts were promising. I mean, I think that some of the tweaks made in the Senate bill were better in terms of this balancing, and we can get there with the House. So I've kept an open mind on the legislation.
And I mean, I imagine it's tricky for you a little bit. Google's one of your top campaign contributors. They're in your district. They put out a blog post that appeared to be opposing Senator Klobuchar's antitrust bill, although actually did not state what they were exactly opposing, claiming that generally Congress's anti-tech stance and proposals were going to harm national security, innovation, small businesses, security and privacy. They didn't provide a lot of specifics about what legislation or proposals they were attacking. But I'm curious what you make of their blanket sort of denunciation of Congress's approach to tech legislation and how you balance your stands with their interests.
Yeah, well, they're obviously in my district, and while I don't take corporate money or PAC money directly from Google, it's fair to say that I have a lot of employees at Google or people, tech leaders at Google and other tech companies who have supported me, and I'm proud of the support of having innovators and technology leaders. But I have been critical of the company in a number of places, including in the book. I say the deal that they have with Apple in terms of being the default browser is, in my view, too exclusive, and that Apple should offer more choices for people in terms of what browser, what type of search engine to use. And I have criticized sort of on Maps, for example, that Google should offer other services on Maps. So I guess there are places on data collection. Obviously, the Internet Bill of Rights are a lot of provisions which they may not like, such as having a collection of data only after your opt-in consent. So I guess the point is I'm not a person who reflexively says technology in Silicon Valley and Apple and Google are bad. I don't think that. I think they do provide significant value to society in terms of the disinformation being spread out and people having access to information, in terms of communication. But I think there needs smart, well-crafted regulations. And I certainly wouldn't have a broadside against the Senate bill as sort of weakening national security or whatever else they said. I mean, I think there has to be specific concerns of whether the legislation is thoughtful or not sort of just a broadside press release.
Yeah, and I imagine that your Internet Bill of Rights also probably isn't something that they would agree with every piece of. I was wondering if you could just outline. You do have, I think, 10 principles. You don't have to go through them all, but I'd be interested just to hear your Bill of Rights. It reminded me of the Obama administration. They proposed a consumer privacy Bill of Rights. I don't know if you ever looked at it.
Of course.
It was interesting. That one had 7 sort of principles and focused them around what individuals should have a right to expect. And your proposal is a little bit more specific around solutions like opt-in consent or net neutrality. I'd be interested to hear about your thinking for choosing sort of more solutions versus principles, and then also the principles themselves that informed you.
Well, I think President Obama, you're obviously very well informed on the topic, made a good start with this. And Todd Park, who was in the Obama administration, is someone I had actually consulted, as well as Megan Smith in drafting this, and then Tim Berners-Lee. I think the difference is when I came around to doing this, it was after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and just having the right to know what was happening with your data, which is basically the orientation of the Obama framework, seemed insufficient. The challenge is that when these companies get our data, and if they use that data to create intricate social profiles and then target us, that is allowing for a lot of manipulation. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that QAnon is growth on Facebook, on YouTube, on other social media sites is because of these companies basically taking data and targeting people who would be susceptible to that message. And then you look at Instagram and the challenges that it has posed, particularly for teenagers, for teenage girls, in terms of depression, anxiety, self-consciousness of how they look. In some cases, it's the worst of junior high now amplified on social media. And so what the Internet Bill of Rights, the core of it is to say, well, we've got to restrict the access and use of data, that the data should not be used to manipulate people's agency. This means first opt-in consent, but it also means data minimization, that people shouldn't be using data in ways that isn't necessary for the core function. And as Jack Balkin writes, and I quote him, there should be sort of a fiduciary duty between people who have this data and the well-being of consumers. And I think if we can restrict the use of this data, we would do a lot in restoring people's confidence that they can be free agents, free thinkers, and not subject to manipulation on these platforms.
You say in the book that if you could choose one law that would improve the online experience, and you could only choose one, you would choose opt-in consent for data collection, transfer, and use. And anyone who's ever been greeted by the accept cookies prompt on a website knows that it's pretty easy to get you to opt in if you just harass the user enough. And, if you think back to situations like the fight for seatbelts in cars, you would have to say that opting in is not good enough for basic safety standards. So given what we know about the harms of data collection, tell me why you think opt-in is a good enough standard.
Well, it's not sufficient, but I think it's necessary and can move the needle. The reality is that you're right. With dark patterns, the GDPR in Europe had opt-in consent, and the tech companies figured out how to have the right type of sizes on the websites, the right type of boxes where basically they were getting many people to consent. So you need real opt-in consent, which means that you need the FTC to be enforcing efforts to manipulate that. And you need regulations to show that you have clear, simple to understand guidelines for people to opt in, that it should not be something that's happening 20 times every time these boxes are popping up, but the first time or second time you're choosing a service that you could give clear guidelines of what you want and what you don't want, and that people aren't being manipulated. And that's not going to solve the entire problem. Partly they're constructing profiles, as I mentioned in the book, based on other people's data. They're able to get your profile through inference. And so we need more than opt-in consent, and that we need data minimization, we need a fiduciary responsibility. But I think opt-in consent is a good first step to help with some of the worst abuses.
And I don't know if you've seen what they do in France, but the regulators there are so strict on opt-in. So when you are in France and you surf the web, it literally says, I accept cookies, I do not. And you just get to say no every time, and it's actually the most fun kind of video game, because you just keep saying no everywhere you go, and you still get to see the whole website. So it would be nice if opt-in could be enforced in that way, like you're describing. What do you think about, though, there's more, aggressive proposals out there. Your colleague, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, who represents my former hometown of Palo Alto, has introduced legislation to ban surveillance advertising, which would force advertisers to return to their old techniques of just advertising based on content near the ad or the geography of where the user is located. Some say it could be a good way to break up the Google and Facebook dominance of online ad markets, and others say it could destroy the industry. What do you think? Do you support her bill?
I'm not for a total ban because I think there are certain uses of targeted advertising that are fine. For example, if I'm living in Fremont, which is where my home, and I want to have pizza, it's fine that the pizza places that are advertising to me are near Fremont and not in Washington, D.C. or in Chicago. And a lot of small businesses actually rely on targeted advertising. A lot of, actually, ironically, smaller newspapers rely on targeted advertising because they can't pay bulk rates. And so just to ban all targeted advertising strikes me as overbroad. But I do think this is where, if individuals can say, here are things that I don't want to be targeted for, that my data shouldn't be used in these ways, then you could come to some medium. And of course, if people are being targeted on categories of race or gender or religion, that is a place where I think you should have broader regulations and prohibitions.
And her bill does allow, by the way, the targeting in Fremont geographically, and so it attempts to do some sort of straddling of that line. But it's hard to know where that line is. I mean, we, as a journalist, I've been writing about Facebook's, discriminatory advertising forever, and once they take out one little targeted thing like, okay, you can't target based on race, then people just use zip code. There's always a way to find a proxy variable, unfortunately. So it does become really hard to draw that line.
Yeah, no, I think on issues of race, I mean, obviously, if there's disparate impact, meaning if you're targeting to a zip code that's really a proxy to race, that should be illegal. My sense is that is probably already illegal under existing laws, but if we want to have a supplemental law to make it clear that that's illegal, we should. And I haven't studied Anna's bill in detail, but if it has sufficient balance where you could still have small businesses and local papers use targeted advertising to build their businesses, but that you're getting at the most egregious types of targeted advertising, then I'd be supportive of that approach.
One thing about the issue that we call privacy, which I call data exploitation, is that the massive collection and use of personal data is also a monopoly issue, right? The big tech firms have the biggest data troves, and this is what gives Google and Facebook, for instance, a duopoly in online advertising and in the AI race. Do you view this data collection also as a monopoly issue in addition to a surveillance and privacy issue? And if so, how would you address it?
Yes. No, I mean, I think it is a challenge. And the challenge is how do you address it without violating privacy, right? So one solution would be, well, do you give other people, other companies access to that data? But then that doesn't seem right if people are giving their data with consent to a few companies to say that their data may be now used to for other companies without their consent. So it's a very challenging conundrum. One possibility of longer term is there are sources of AI that are now emerging that I write briefly about in the book that don't require troves of data. So, for example, when a young child learns a word, a cat or a dog, we don't show a young child thousands and thousands of pictures of cats and dogs. They just kind of intuitively figure it out. And Josh Tenenbaum at MIT is working on that. And I think if those technologies emerge that minimize data's value, that would be helpful. But, I think in terms of Google or Apple or other antitrust issues, there are plenty of other issues on going after antitrust. I'm open to data. I guess I just would want to balance it with privacy and would have to think that through.
Speaking of AI, you do have a 5-point plan for addressing AI in the book. And I just have to add, I'm definitely giving Elizabeth Warren, I have a plan for that vibes from your book. And so you suggest we need government audits of high-risk AI systems, disclosure of algorithmic bias through bias impact statements, federal investments for the job loss created by AI, federal regulations for the workers who do the grunt work of AI labeling, meaningful human control in AI weapon systems, and finally, a strategy for maintaining our lead in AI compared with China. There's a lot in there. I wanted to start with a slight pushback on the idea of job loss created by AI, because I remember the time when we all thought workers were going to be replaced by robots. But weirdly, what's been happening, it seems, is more like managers are being replaced by robots. So all these workers, their boss is an app, right? The gig workers work for an algorithm. Amazon warehouse workers effectively work for an algorithm. And as much as we might dislike our bosses, it turns out that having a human boss is actually kind of an advantage. We've been doing a series at the Markup called Working for an Algorithm about the ways that people are scammed. The Postmates, for instance, are being scammed out of money by people who call them and say they're calling from the main office. How would the Postmate know? They've never spoken to a human. And then they get their account drained, right? And so when you talk about like investments for job loss created by AI, I'm just curious what kind of jobs you see as being lost. And then, like, for instance, do we want to bring back these human managers? Is it middle management really the place we're going to want to reinvest?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I certainly don't believe we're headed to a jobless future by any stretch. I mean, I think one of the points I make with Amazon, where I call for a $15 minimum wage, and Amazon moved to $15, and everyone said, "Oh, if you have a higher wage, you're going to have more robots, and they're going to displace workers." And it turns out Amazon hires over 800,000, 900,000 people. The challenge is that they don't have often the dignity in their workplace, and they are being often surveilled by these technology driven machines. So I guess I would say two things on the displacement that I was talking about. It is the case that things that are largely routinized tasks can be done with AI or technology, and I would just say that we have to make sure then that all workers still have a dignity and have incomes and have more to their contribution than just the parts that can be robotized. And so how do we do that? How do we make sure that they're learning about the technology, using the technology, and also learning the skills to contribute? And that's, I think, it's so less about the aggregate job loss and more about making sure it doesn't disproportionately impact certain communities. And then in terms of the boss point, or who you work for, I think that's a very thoughtful point, that you want to have human discretion still there, and you want to have workers having more empowerment at the workplace. One point I make in the book, and I cite Josh Cohen, who's a really thoughtful philosopher and now at Apple Computers, but he says, in a democracy, we often talk about our freedom as citizens, but so much of our time is at a workplace. And if we don't feel free there, if we're suffering the indignities of our boss or certainly of a robot, what does that really mean for freedom in a society? And so I believe definitely that whether it's a robot or not, the workers need more of a voice in shaping the 21st century workplace, which is certainly at Amazon warehouses they don't have.
Yeah, absolutely. The Amazon warehouses, as you know, right, they've been advocating for the right to take bathroom breaks. I mean, that's definitely a little bit of a long road from there to human dignity in the workplace. Let's talk a little bit more about AI in China. You talk about how we need to make sure we're going to win the arms race against China, and you quote John Mearsheimer, who's one of my favorite professors from our shared alma mater, University of Chicago, talking about the concerns of letting China get ahead of us. But, I wonder, what are you worried about them getting ahead of us in? Because what we hear about with China is them using AI to repress and surveil their citizens, to build autonomous weapon systems. I mean, are these the things we want to compete with them on?
Well, there are good uses of AI and bad uses of AI, but certainly we don't want them to develop ability in space or abilities in submarines and underwater naval capacity that puts us at a disadvantage. I mean, I believe, for example, that we have to make sure policies on Taiwan, that we don't want in any way China ever to consider invading Taiwan. But more broadly, the use of AI, the use of emerging technologies can propel productivity, can propel economic growth, can propel wealth generation. And those are things that we want in the United States. And I guess precisely to your point, we want values of liberty and values of privacy embedded in these platforms, and not values and not a society that doesn't necessarily have those values in their technology.
And so what do you think it will take for us to win the AI race with China?
Well, as I advocate in the book, that I think we need more. We're doing a lot in terms of the private sector investment. We're 8-1 on China, but the government really hasn't been involved. And I think the government needs to be involved for two reasons. One, the type of transformative AI the private sector may not have an interest for the reasons you mentioned earlier. I mean, it may be in the interest of tech companies to have AI dependent on data because it gives them a lot of advantage. Doesn't mean that they're going to try to kill the innovation that's trying to be data-less AI, but they may not be investing in there. But the government could. We could be looking at investments at universities and NSF on types of AI that may not be as data-dependent. And then we should be looking at the investments in the broader education and training of folks to be operating in this world. One of the biggest disservices that people have done, in my view, is when they say, oh, if you want to have a digital job, a tech job, you got to learn how to code. And, I talk about computer science education, but it's so intimidating. And people say, I don't, I know you learned how to code at a very young age, but most people say, I don't want to do all that math and science and technology. It turns out as technology advances, actually it becomes more usable. So, I know very little about a car. And my dad knows everything about a car, how to open the hood, how to fix things, but I don't really need that anymore. I mean, the technology is so advanced. And same thing is true with computers. The technology, as it advances, it actually makes it more accessible. And there are millions of these jobs that if you just have a basic proficiency of understanding machines, people will be able to do without even a college degree. And part of the project of the book is try to demystify what digital jobs are.
Yeah, and look, I've been a little bit remiss because actually that is like a lot of your book is about job creation, right? And I haven't actually touched on that yet. So let's talk about that. You have a lot, you're really passionate about bringing jobs to places outside of Silicon Valley. And you have ideas for how to do that. It's an interesting question because a lot of people are also advocating for we need to build more affordable housing in Silicon Valley and in other tech hubs and bring people to there, right? So there's different ways to view these issues, bring the people to where the jobs are now or bring the jobs to new locations. It seems like you've staked out a position on the latter.
Well, I advocate both. I mean, I'm for building more housing in Silicon Valley just for the internal equity in Silicon Valley. As you know, having visited there's a lot of inequality in the valley. I represent a district with over $11 trillion of market cap in the surrounding areas. And yet in East San Jose and parts of San Jose, people are hugely rent burdened, 50-60% of their income going to rent. So from a perspective of just the valley being a more equitable place to live, we've got to build more housing and more affordable housing there and overcome the NIMBYism in some of the parts of the community. But that's not going to do enough for the rest of the country. And one of the things I say is there are a lot of people who don't want to move to Fremont or Palo Alto. And we underestimate their attachment to their hometown. We underestimate the sense of value they may place on their tradition and their culture, and how people actually may be more reluctant to move now, given the costs, given the need for childcare, and given the changing in the country. There's a familiarity of staying put. And so the promise of the book, in some sense, is new job creation without cultural displacement. What if we could bring more economic prosperity to communities without asking you to move if you don't want to, and without asking your kids to buy a one-way ticket out? And I think post-COVID, this forced remote experiment actually makes it possible. One of the critiques, I had an essay on my book in the Wall Street Journal, and one of my friends in the Valley said, Ro, I don't think we need any of your policies because we're already doing this. We're already recruiting all over the country and recruiting in African-American communities and Latino communities in rural America and having companies everywhere. Well, maybe they're doing a little bit more than in the past, but we've got a long ways to go, and I think we can have policies that accelerate that.
And what is the key policy you think that would make that transition happen?
I would argue two things. First, a significant investment in our land-grant universities, our HBCUs, our smaller private colleges, in partnering with the private sector to give people a credential or skills in what a digital job looks like. And a lot of these things, we don't have the proper training in a lot of the places right now, and we haven't really funded it. And I believe if you do that, you would provide a pathway to many people having these jobs. I'm working actually with Google to do that in a number of rural communities and in HBCUs. I worked with Accenture. I mean, there are a couple of models where it's worked. We should scale that. And the second thing is, I would say for government contracts, require a percentage of these tech companies to have a workforce that is rural or African American, Latino to bid on these contracts. And I think that would incentivize them to diversify their workforce. And same with gender. I mean, there are huge issues. I have a whole chapter on sort of the gender and racial exclusions of the Valley.
I mean, absolutely. Look, I grew up in Silicon Valley, thought I was going to go into technology, worked at Hewlett-Packard, and there's a reason I'm not there. And I went into journalism, and it was because it wasn't a culture that was very receptive to women.
Well, I think you've done okay with all the
totally
Pulitzer Prize winning finalist books. I think your career worked out.
I'm doing fine. But Silicon Valley is, very white and male still, right? And it often seems like that is reflected in their products. I mean, a lot of these products are things that men want, like, Viagra delivery to your home. And I'm still waiting for them to build me a robot that will fold laundry. That's my big dream for technology. But you have a proposal in your book about, sort of diversifying Silicon Valley, which has to do with giving the VC firms some tax credits to prompt them to invest in startups that are led by Black and brown entrepreneurs or women entrepreneurs. I want to hear a little bit more about that because, those are firms that are already pretty savvy about getting tax credits. I'm always concerned about these big companies getting more tax credits.
Well, right now, I mean, the people who are writing the checks, as you put it, are largely non-diverse. And by non-diverse, it's not just that they don't have women or African Americans. They don't have people from rural communities. They don't have people from many parts of the country. And so what I say is if you are going to be writing checks into funds that primarily fund women entrepreneurs or African American entrepreneurs, there has to be some incentive for these venture capitalists to do that. And while I'm for increasing the capital gains tax rate, one possibility could be that your rate isn't increased. You have the same rate or a lesser rate if you're actually putting the money into funds that are funding African American entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs. You look at the statistics, and I was shocked. I mean, about $120 billion of venture capital, and less than 1% of it is going to African American or Latino founders, and it's a staggering less than 0.5% going to women of color. So, it's a huge disparity, and if you don't have some government program to fix that, I don't think it fixes organically.
Yeah. You also propose, you have the Endless Frontier Act, I guess, which is now included in the infrastructure bill.
In the innovation bill, yeah.
And innovation, sorry. Can't keep track of all those bills. And you basically are talking about how boosting federal funding for all sorts of research from NSF and also innovation, I think that would be directed also to more diverse groups. Is that correct?
Correct. I mean, it would be directed towards the middle of this country, the South, towards and have greater gender and racial inclusion. And it would be the largest investment in our country's history in science and technology. And it's passed the Senate. And we're hoping to pass it in the House, actually, in February. And it would be enormous for semiconductors. I mean, creating semiconductor manufacturing, which would deal with the supply chain. Intel, in my district, just announced $20 billion in Ohio to start a new semiconductor plant. I wish President Biden were out there, actually, in Ohio. Certainly Trump would have been out there. But those are the types of things that I think really can move the needle. I mean, if we can have significant investment in advanced technology and manufacturing, and we're spreading that out around this country, it's creating new economic opportunity. At the heart of the book is this sense, you had the deindustrialization of so many places in this country. You've had the lack of economic opportunity in places, and these are proud places. I mean, Cleveland was the Silicon Valley of a time in the 20th century, as was Detroit. They don't want just all these Silicon Valley billionaires making money and having some handout. They want to participate with pride in the economic production of the 21st century. And I think providing a roadmap to doing that and providing a roadmap for people in different parts of the country to work with folks on the coast may help reduce some of the bitterness, some of the division that's plaguing our democracy. And really that was the motivating factor for writing the book is how do we have technology in the service of democratic ideals as opposed to divorced from democratic ideals. And
interestingly, it does involve the government really steering the ship and move and forcing a little bit of redistribution. It's an interesting, and it reminds me a little bit of the space race, when we got all mobilized to beat the Russians into space, and that did spur the last big sort of government spending on research, I think, in science and technology. So you're kind of proposing a similar thing, no?
Similar to the space race, and of course I'm grateful for that because that's how my parents came to the United States. My father's an engineer, and there were two things that basically changed the law so that he could come from India. One was Dr. King, the Civil Rights Movement, and that led to the 65 Immigration Reform Act so that non-Europeans basically could come. There were huge quotas against that before 65. And then the space race, where people said we want engineers and scientists in this country. And what I'm saying is, yes, let's have that investment, but let's have the distribution of opportunity. And here's where I think it's important to have a distinction. This is not redistribution post-economic production, though we need, in my view, higher taxes on billionaires and millionaires. That's after production. I think the harder challenge is how do we have distribution of opportunity prior to production? There's a brilliant book, Minoj Shafik, head of the London School of Economics, and she makes this whole point about how the progressive left, the Democrats, need a vision that empowers people before to participate in the productive capacity of the economy. And this book is trying to do that in the digital space.
Well, it's a very ambitious agenda. You do have answers for everything, so I wanted to talk about a few things that you touch on, some hot buttons. So fake news, everybody has a solution for fake news, although there is no solution also at the same time. Yours is sort of an innovative approach, which I think, if I understand it correctly, involves people getting to choose their own algorithm that they use to curate their news feed, and that algorithm is in some ways open source. It seemed like an interesting idea. I wanted to hear a little bit more about it, and also seemed like it might be easy for malicious actors to game it.
So it's a very, very challenging situation, especially with the First Amendment. And you don't want the government being the arbiter of truth. And most people don't want Zuckerberg or Dorsey being the arbiter of truth. And so I say, well, how can we get better conversation? It turns out these two professors had done this study that shows that if you actually crowdsource what news people listen to, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats converge on 20 sites that they think all would be good sources of news. Now, it includes in there Fox and it includes MSNBC, but it doesn't include some of the real far-out stuff. And what I say is if you had an option of streaming where you could stream sort of a crowdsourced news option, then at least maybe we start to build a common vocabulary. But the point of it is not that particular insight or proposal. There's another proposal I have which says, if someone is pro-choice and pro-life and you give, let's say I'm pro-choice and I send someone who's pro-life an article saying why they should be pro-choice, they're likely actually to dig into their position. They're not likely to move or deliberate. But if it's a friend who sends them that, they may actually consider. So why don't we have social networks exposing you to alternative perspectives your friends have? That would be a simple tweak, actually, that could move the needle. My point is there's not sufficient reflection in these social media companies about their responsibility to democracy, about what they could do to be innovative to improve democratic deliberation. And, they should probably go to the political science faculty and hire 50 of these folks to think about thought experiments about how they can be stakeholders in democracy. But they first have to admit that that's part of their role, and it's not just profit maximization as a private company.
Just to play devil's advocate, right? Most companies don't see their mission as anything other than maximizing profit, right? And there is an argument out there that these companies that basically govern our speech, the political discourse that we have mostly takes place on their platforms, that they should be utilities, because then they would be forced to be neutral, and then we wouldn't have them optimizing for profits because that's what their shareholders demand, but they would actually be forced to have a public mandate. What do you think of that argument?
Well, let me address both points. I don't think a lot of media companies are simply about profit maximization. I mean, I think that a lot of companies care about profit, but, let's say, I don't know if you're still at the New York Times or journalism, if you've worked there. I mean, they have a sense of, yes, we got to sell newspapers, but we also have to care about what we're contributing to the public debate. And I think some of these companies have to identify themselves as partly media companies. Yes, they're private companies, but they're also media companies with some obligation. I'm reluctant to have these companies become utilities for a couple of reasons. First, I think that hurts in part the innovation. I think it also there's a guaranteed rate of profit, so it may entrench these companies and not allow other competitors to emerge. And then there's certain types of speech. A public forum that is a public station is important, and one contributor of speech, but there are a lot of speech forums we want that may not be as sanitized as a public forum that the government sets the reasonable rules of debate. You may want language of protest, language of anger, and so what I rather have is a multiplicity of these forums by having good competition law, and then hope with good privacy laws, with the Internet Bill of Rights, and that you see as social media ethics emerge, just like you've seen a journalistic ethics emerge.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think that these companies have resisted wanting to be called media companies for all sorts of reasons, largely because of liability, right? They don't want to be liable for the content they publish. As a journalist, I spend all my time worried about liability and being sued and being accurate about everything I say. And so, this is a hot button issue, but where do you stand on Section 230 and liability for the tech companies? Should there be carve-outs, more carve-outs than there are in Section 230 for the liability, the immunity that they've enjoyed so far?
Yes, there should. For example, I've been giving the most egregious example. Facebook, according to The Ugly Truth, the book recently published by two journalists in the New York Times, the private security knew before January 6th that there were going to be threats on the Vice President Pence's life and threats on members of Congress's life with concrete detail. And there was a decision that Facebook made not to share that information with law enforcement and just to sit on it. That, in my view, is outrageous. I mean, the Section 230 should be amended at the very least to say, if you have speech on your platforms that doesn't meet the Brandenburg test, that is an incitement to violence or an incitement to illegal conduct, you have to remove it. You could require a court order to do it, but that, I think, would clear these platforms of some of the most egregious content. You could have also some basic enforcement of consumer protection and public health safety on these platforms. So now, do I think that they should be responsible for every single post that millions of posts? No. I mean, I think there has to be, again, a balance. But there certainly can be certain reforms to 230, and a good start of it would be to have court-ordered speech removed, which violates Brandenburg.
One of the more intriguing proposals I've heard about Section 230 is that the companies should be liable for content that they choose to algorithmically amplify. So if they just circulate things chronologically or whatever, then they don't have to take responsibility. But if they're boosting things, promoting them in people's feeds, that then they've kind of involved themselves in the content and that they then should be liable.
I'm open to that in terms of if that is content is illegal, you're saying under certain standards, and then they're amplifying that, then they become a publisher in some sense of that content. I mean, that's something that I would certainly look at, and it seems to me consistent with the First Amendment, because they obviously would have the First Amendment right to amplify it, but they don't have the First Amendment right to amplify defamation, and then they're actually involved. So some that's another place where we can look to have reform.
So let's talk about something that I don't think is in your book that much, but is so hot these days, which is crypto, blockchain, Web3, whatever you want to call it. it seems to me like you mention it as a cool innovation in the book. I guess you pushed for some amendments recently that the crypto industry wanted clarified in legislation. But as you probably know, right, there's just enormous amounts of fraud in the crypto space. I think the FTC said that there had been more than $80 million worth of scams just in the past 6 months of crypto. And so I'm just curious, what do you think about this industry? Is it innovative or is it a Ponzi scheme? And what does it need to be done to rein it in, if anything?
Well, I definitely think there's some baseline innovation to blockchain. And the baseline innovation, as I understand it, to blockchain is that it allows you to transfer your money in a quicker way, things settle quicker, and eliminating without a middle person. And so you're basically saving on transaction costs for remittances overseas or for moving money from one place to the other. And it also allows you, for example, to engage in contracts without needing necessarily a third-party verifier, so you could have smart contracts. Finally, you could think of having textbooks distributed this way, where everyone gets a token who wants to read a college textbook, reducing the costs of distribution of books while keeping intellectual property. So there are definitely, in my understanding, a value that's being created. And here I have a respectful disagreement with Professor Paul Krugman, who says, well, it's just digital gold. It's partly could be digital gold, but it's also, I think, partly value added. But there's no doubt that there's been a lot of fraud, and there's no doubt that if something under the Howey test, which is a famous SEC case, is something that's seeking investment for appreciation, then it should be regulated under the SEC law of securities. And if someone is actually doing that and seeking investment, that should be regulated that way. Now, there may be needing new laws of what a digital asset is in terms of how to regulate it, because a digital asset may have some sense of decentralization where the company isn't as involved. And so perhaps if it's deemed a security, what would be most helpful instead of 10Ks and 10Qs is to learn more about the blockchain itself. We can see what the regulatory framework should look like, but there definitely needs to be a regulatory framework in place.
We have only a little bit of time left, so I want to end on an issue that I think everybody cares about and is one of the most emotional issues in tech, which is children and screen time. During pandemic, all of us parents, I think, have given up the fight. I don't know, maybe just me, and let my kids do whatever they wanted on the screens. But you talk about how there should be there's like flagrant violations of COPA. You argue the Children's Online Privacy Act, and that the companies should really face strict liability, kick off kids under 13, and use maybe AI to determine if people are lying about their ages. I'd like to hear more about what you think can be done there and whether it's too late. If the horse is out of the barn, every kid is already glued to a screen.
Well, first, I think it's a very hard time to be a parent in this age. I say that as a father, and so we have to figure out how we support parents in making decisions that allow kids to still reflect and think and play outside and not just be glued to their device. And the dirty secret in Silicon Valley is a lot of these tech leaders keep their tech gadgets away from their kids. And so how do we ensure that? But what I write about in the book is it's always struck me as absurd that these companies can't figure out if someone is too young on their platforms. I mean, give me a break. You have algorithms that can figure out everything else, including how to target a person down to exactly what ad they can see, and you're telling me you don't know if someone is under 13 on your platform? So my view is, one, we should raise the age of COPA, raise it to 15 or 16, and have strict liability if someone under that age is on your platforms. And the reason I would cover teenagers is, Instagram is just appalling. They basically have data knowing that they are creating more depression, more suicidal thoughts amongst teenagers. And how do we accept that? I mean, there ought to be consumer protection laws that make that illegal, and those kids shouldn't be having likes and shares if that's what is the result. I mean, even if you want to have likes and shares for adults, you have to make sure that for minors there are greater protections. And I write about where I think some of the things can be strengthened. Senator Markey has been leading the effort in the Senate. It seems to me that actually has bipartisan support and could become law.
Great. Well, I'll leave it at an optimistic moment that maybe we will have some protection for our kids. And thank you very much for taking time to discuss your book. It was a real pleasure to discuss all this with you.
I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, listen to C-SPAN's podcast about books. Learn about the latest nonfiction books and best-selling authors. In each episode, we report on bestsellers lists and book reviews from around the country. You'll also hear authors talking about their latest books and insider interviews with nonfiction book publishing industry experts.